Before I get into the formal review, I want to take a second to thank everyone who liked, commented, and subscribed following my first video on Destiny 2. I'm sort of new to content creation, and despite having plenty of experience with writing, I'm still learning the ropes with editing, recording, everything else. So to see such a warm reception, it really humbles me. At the time of recording this, the video is over 15,000 views, and I've gained nearly 500 subscribers just from one video, my first video. So thank you so much. There might be more Destiny content in the future, but I'm pretty weary about both playing the game right now, as well as shoehorning myself into just a single title. That being said, I hope those of you who enjoy my content thus far will stick around with me. And with you, I hope I'll be able to reach even more people to just talk about the things I love. And P.S. I also got a pop filter, if you can't tell, so the mic quality will probably be a lot better. And to preface this review even further, there's not going to be any substantive spoilers. You're only going to be seeing gameplay from zones that you can access immediately, classes that you can access immediately, and absolutely no narrative spoilers or world boss footage. Any talk of secrets is going to be extremely limited, and prefaced with a small spoiler warning beforehand, as to allow as blind of a playthrough as possible for new players. If you want to know my thoughts on a piece of spoilery content, just feel free to message me on Twitter. Enjoy the video! Remnant, or more specifically, Remnant 2, but also Remnant. That is, Remnant 1. Now, unlike a lot of people who are reviewing Remnant 2, I actually played the first game when it released back in 2019. That's not a dig at other reviewers, by the way. They're probably way better than I am at this, and it's great that so many more people are just finding out about Remnant through the sequel. My point here is that I not only have experience with From the Ashes, but I also have plenty of experience with other Souls-likes, so I think my perspective could be a lot different than other content creators who seem to be picking up the game from looter shooters and ARPGs that are going through some rough patches right now. While these players might focus more heavily on the build crafting and number crunching of Remnant, my experience has been a more healthy mix of both appreciating these aspects while also noticing all the tiny details and refinements of the Souls-like design elements. Remnant from the Ashes was a solid stab at a concept that only existed in really scuffed Dark Souls mods. Dark Souls with guns. You've probably heard it 80 billion times at this point, and while it's definitely kind of representative of what Remnant 1 was, it definitely doesn't give the whole picture. At its core, R1 was a Souls-like, but once you completed the campaign, the game's systems opened up even further, and Gunfire Games grew a small but dedicated following of players. Players who were gripped by the gameplay, but stayed for the systems. In Remnant 1, you could essentially scale your character infinitely, and with much greater returns than in your standard Souls game. Bosses dropped unique items, and had alternate kill methods, encouraging you to re-roll areas multiple times to fill out your arsenal of rings, amulets, armor, and weapons. Now imagine everything I just laid out to you, but more. The opening sequence of Remnant 2 is almost worryingly humble. You play as a random survivor on a post-apocalyptic Earth, joined by your companion Cass. You're searching for Ward 13, a safe haven for humanity that has miraculously been transformed from an underground bunker into a bustling seaside town. You find it, if that wasn't already evident, with some help from some of its inhabitants, one of whom gets sucked into a giant red crystal. I don't know exactly why humanity still keeps these things around, given how they are portals to highly technologically advanced hostile civilizations, but that's above my pay grade. Plus, we get to talk to cool goat people, which is pretty awesome. Shout out to my main man, the Flautist. Love that guy.
Music? That can't be.
To me, friend Paxultek. I am here. Friend Paxultek, it returns.
I love him so much. And that's the setup. Now you have to jump from realm to realm, searching for your kinda sorta friend Clementine, and try to find a way to push back the series' main antagonists, the Root. To quickly touch on the narrative before getting into the meaty everything else going on, It's not too bad, actually. Each world has multiple storylines which you can embark on, totally at random, and usually have a small central cast of likable characters. Nobody here has a crazy amount of depth, but that's okay. Gunfire clearly focused a lot more on each world's deep history and culture, which can be seen through the stellar environments of each realm, as well as substantive dialogue, writings, and voice logs from NPCs and interactables out in the wild. The worst part is definitely the central storyline. It's fairly predictable and features some of the least enjoyable characters and dialogue on offer, but it's certainly not capital B bad. It has its moments, but pales in comparison to the more lore-rich genre quests you'll be doing on the side. All in all, a massive improvement over the first Remnant, which almost didn't even have a story to begin with. It probably doesn't mean much at all coming from somebody who's only now getting their degree in game writing, but the writers at Gunfire should be quite proud of themselves for fitting so many interesting moments into such a weird shell.
Dark Soul!
Okay, let's just get this out of the way. Souls-likes. As a genre. Souls-likes are defined mainly by a small collection of design pillars. These include, but are not confined or limited to, refreshable, consumable healing items, commonly referred to as Estus, limited, scattered checkpoints, often referred to as bonfires, an immensely strong defensive mechanic that can be turned into an offensive mechanic with proper use, usually a roll or a parry, carefully designed enemies that must be respected at all times, no matter the size. The list goes on. As a byproduct of these design elements, Souls-likes are typically difficult, demanding players pay attention lest they get styled on by what is effectively a worker ant. By every definition of the term, Remnant 2 is a Souls-like. You get a consumable healing item called a Dragon Heart, rest at spread out crystals, roll to avoid enemy attacks, etc., etc. Don't let that scare you away if you've never played one of these titles, because Remnant 2 has some key differences from others like it, usually what people first imagine as most of From Software's catalog. On top of seamless co-op allowing for friends and strangers alike to hop in and help, Remnant 2 has 4 difficulty options, 3 of which are available off the bat and are catered to all different types of players. If you're new to the game and terrified of some skeleton on a wheel jump scaring you and causing your health to vanish, you can select the easiest difficulty, Survivor. If you're a fan of Souls-likes or shooters, but a bit intimidated with a new concept, you can select the middle difficulty, Veteran. And if you're a masochist, like myself, you can select the hardest starting difficulty, Nightmare. Another key difference is right in the pitch, Dark Souls with guns. While melee builds are certainly viable and melee combat as a whole feels pretty punchy, most people are going to gravitate towards using firearms, and that's totally intentional. While things like magic, flintlocks, and shurikens are present in other Souls-like titles, none of them offer the ability to literally just play a shooter. Inherently having that space between you and your enemy provides a sense of comfort and familiarity, while also allowing Gunfire to reverse a standard within the genre. Usually in these types of games, your opponent will have some of their strongest, scummiest moves reserved for long-distance scenarios to encourage the player to dance with them toe-to-toe. In Remnant, it's the opposite. If an enemy type even has a ranged ability to begin with, it's typically not very powerful. What you should really be scared of are enemies that can close the gap, pressuring you and unleashing devastating grabs or AoE chunk attacks. If you've ever dabbled in game development, you'd know that making a Souls-like is extremely, almost comically hard. It's almost like a fighting game, but instead of a 2-dimensional plane, it's a 3-dimensional, highly curated map. And instead of there just being another player you have to fight with a single character and a single set of frame data, there's tons of different enemies, all with their own behaviors, health pools, attacks, frame data, etc. And on top of that, the player has tons of playstyles they can choose from, all of which have varying ranges, weapon types, armor types, and you guessed it, frame data. The blanket covering all of this immense workup has to feel extremely good as well. You can't have your roll feeling clunky, or else everything feels terrible to fight. You can't have your attacks feel slightly slow to come out, or you'll be too scared to ever swing. You can't have your hitboxes be too wonky, or else the game just feels unfair. If you understand the difficulty of working in this genre, you'll get how impressive it is that Remnant 2 doesn't feel bad at all. The roll, while slow, takes the character a long distance, and generally has nice feedback. The heal, while also slow, allows the player to move around while using it, as well as to cancel it with a roll. And Remnant's unique aspect, the gunplay, is probably the best I've experienced in a third-person shooter since playing the Uncharted series. Even the spacing of bonfires feels fair, usually being placed at the beginning and end of a dungeon or an open space. While it might seem harsh at first, this does encourage exploration of levels in search of shortcuts and further execution of your game plan, which is much better than showering the player in free bonfires as far as I see it. The game feels damn good, which is kind of a shock considering the track record of those trying to emulate From Software's success. Arguably the most important thing to get right in this genre, however, is enemy design, especially boss fights. After experiencing every biome and almost every boss fight as far as I'm aware, I think Gunfire did really well here. I wish the grunt tier enemies were a bit more of a threat, as in most cases you can kind of just shrug them off, which I'm not quite used to with these types of games. I enjoy the feeling of always being on my toes, the feeling of no matter how good I get at the game, I can easily be humbled by some innocuous hollow that manages to catch me with my guard down. That's not quite the case here, and it's a little disappointing. Offsetting this, though, are the really wonderful mid-tier enemies and elites. These beefier foes are usually either just better, more intimidating versions of their grunt counterparts with a more interesting moveset, or an entirely unique enemy that drops special materials on death. To not spoil too much, one elite enemy type has seemingly impervious armor. However, upon paying attention to their attacks, I noticed that when just outside of melee range, they would throw a delayed sticky bomb, which could then be shot as they walked over it, dealing massive self-damage on its explosion. There are plenty of other elites in the game, probably around 4 or 5 for each of the races, each one providing a sort of puzzle for you to solve in the middle of combat. I really enjoyed most of my time fighting these higher tier enemies, as they always demanded something different out of me. Bosses are a bit of a mixed bag, leaning positively though. I'd say about 70 to 75% of the boss fights in this game are really solid and memorable, with minimal to no unfair moments. Around 10 to 15% were in the middle. Nothing groundbreaking, but nothing awful either. Perfectly acceptable encounters that may have had an eyebrow-raising attack here or there, but again, nothing crazy. Another 10 to 15% would be the remaining fights, which I didn't really like much at all. These bosses were what I would say are affected by a gradually worrying concept I like to call Elden Ringification. Now, anyone who has played Elden Ring in addition to other From games probably understand what I'm talking about here. To put it bluntly, these bosses are usually plagued by things like annoying AoEs, possible stun locks, and one-shots, usually a grab or a thrust. While these fights are an admittedly small fraction of the overall experience, they did leave a slightly sour taste in my mouth. On the whole though, the boss design in Remnant 2 sneaked its way in amongst some of the better Souls-like titles, especially those by smaller studios. Remnant 2 isn't just a Souls-like though, it's also a gear game. Throughout your adventures, you'll acquire all sorts of loot to help you on your journey, each with a set acquisition method and wholly unique effect. Amulets are the core of your build. Rings often support your amulet and allow for an even broader scope for what you want to do. Armor decides your damage reduction and your dodge speed. Your weapons, well, I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. Hell, even your Estus can be modified and swapped out. While there are general umbrellas that gear can fall under, like bleed, poison, crit, and melee, there's a surprising amount of cross-building at play in Remnant 2. My first real build was a hybrid status effect build in which my machine gun, the Merciless, would inflict bleed damage on ramping up, and my handgun, Nebula, would spew toxic fumes at close range. Both of these worked in conjunction with my amulet, the Energized Neck Coil, which buffed all of my status effects by 50% and would cause an explosion worth 20% of that new total status damage when applying an effect. Now, every time I tickled a grunt with my low damage gas thrower, they would instantly blow up along with everything around them. To complement this, every time I reset with a large enemy and laid into them with my bleed LMG, I deal a decent amount of burst and stagger. Note, this is without factoring in other parts of my build. my rings, my mods, my mutators, my class decisions. It was just my weapons and my amulet. You might be a bit confused at first on how to actually obtain all these cool new toys. You'll probably be drowned under a raging tsunami of rings, with the odd amulet or weapon mod thrown in the mix too. That's because Remnant 2 isn't your typical looter shooter. In fact, it's not a looter shooter whatsoever, no matter the impression you may have gotten. Most of Remnant's arsenal is discovered through lots and lots and lots of secrets, with a few outliers purchasable from vendors in Ward 13. Rings are scattered pretty loosely around the environment, so you don't have to worry too much about those. Just about everything else, though, is tucked away, taking advantage of one of Souls' least appreciated keystones: exploration. In Souls titles, the developers will often hide vital items like Estus charges in tiny little nooks and crannies. This, from an outside perspective, can seem kinda mean, even punishing. From a design standpoint, however, it's quite genius. By keeping run-defining gear and life-saving boons tucked away, the game is subtly pushing players to take a second, breathe, take in the world, and focus on improving their gameplay. R2 takes this dial, cranks it to the max, rips it off, and chucks it across the room. Climactic boss fights typically have an alternate kill condition, which can be engaged with through everything between a prior quest line or prioritizing a particular part of the boss's body. These secret kills give different rewards, some of them even containing build-defining guns. Dungeons often keep puzzles hidden in far-flung corners, asking the player to flex their mental muscles in order to string together a code, align a set of symbols, tune a giant wind instrument. The variety seems endless. Each riddle solved, each boss slain, each offshoot parkour course conquered has the potential to bring you just one more piece closer to completing your dream build's puzzle. But no matter how many secrets you unravel, you can't possibly get them all on your first playthrough. Not even close. That's part of what makes R2 so special. Its inherent replayability from this combination of genres is only enhanced by how much it leans into player discovery. Don't worry about being weak either. While you won't get the perfect setup on your initial run, the most famous of Remnant's secrets are more than willing to do the heavy lifting. Classes. When I was just a wee little baby raccoon, I fell in love with an underground indie title by the name of Skylanders Swap Force. You see, Swap Force was a Toys to Life game in which you could take the torso of a figure and slap it on top of the legs of another figure, creating a weird abomination that combined the attacks and the movement of the two characters. Ever since then, I've been hungry, thirsty, naked and afraid, waiting for another game that would take this novel design idea even further. In Remnant 2, dual classes are here, and not only are they wonderful, but they're combined with that insane focus on exploration. Upon completing the tutorial, you can pick one archetype from a selection of 4 starting choices. There's the Medic, which specializes in team support and sustain, the Hunter, who can mark enemy weak points for huge headshot damage, the Challenger, a close-range bruiser with a slew of buffs that they can apply to themselves, and the Handler, a class made in direct response to complaints about the solo experience in Remnant 1. There are numerous other archetypes hidden within the game, all of which offer entirely new ways to play. Each class gets access to one of 3 cooldowns, a total of 4 passive abilities, a unique trait card, and a key passive, which is activated by selecting it as your primary archetype. As mentioned before, 2 archetypes can be selected at the same time, allowing for tons of build variety and intriguing combinations, even between classes you thought had no chance working together. The setup I settled on for this video's character was a Challenger-Handler hybrid, which seems a bit odd. Wouldn't the tankiness of the Challenger kit and the Handler's dog clash with each other? Quite the contrary, actually, as my dog pulling aggro cleared a path for me to get in with my up-close damage boost and skills, while I had enough raw damage reduction to get away if things got dicey. I can't talk too much about all the hybrid archetypes I've built, but what I can say is that this design concept needs to be adopted in way more games than it is right now. The player expression, customization, and sense of progression that dual class systems enable is extremely hard to beat. Alright, so I'm going to use the remaining time in this video to go over some miscellaneous items that I haven't gotten the chance to cover yet, as they could be some hot button topics or just simple nice to haves for people. Let's start with performance. Now, I'm not an expert at benchmarking and I don't have multiple rigs to test the game on, but I do have my own experience as a normal player with a fairly beefy PC. I'll put my specs on screen right now so you can view them, compare them to your build, and decide if my issues would end up being better or worse with your computer. On my system, I typically run the game at 1440p, high settings with DLSS set to ultra performance, and 40 series AI frame generation enabled. I do have the most recent NVIDIA drivers for Remnant 2 specifically for those wondering. With this, I'm able to get around 90 to 100 frames most of the time. Keywords there being most of the time. Remnant 2 gives me a lot of harsh frame drops, sometimes for entire seconds on end, especially when it's left running for extended periods of time. I'm not sure if this is due to a memory leak, where me needing to just upgrade my RAM from 16 gigs to 32, but it typically runs fine for a good while before performance starts to heavily drop. Gunfire has been made aware of these issues and are currently working on improvements. If you have a graphics card without access to upscaling technologies or are generally weary around less optimized games, it might be worth holding off for now. A large change made in the shift from Remnant 1 to 2 was in regards to the economy. Scrap, the equivalent to souls, is fairly difficult and slow to come by without a dedicated farming method, while the cap on trait points, the equivalent to raw stats, was drastically reduced from essentially infinite to 65. This means that you can no longer just grind until you have every trait maxed out. You have to effectively distribute the points that you earned into the traits that you care about most. For some, this will be a welcome change, as it means there's more reason to make new characters and establish an individual identity for them. For others, it could be a huge blow, as many found a lot of enjoyment from the first game came from the trait point climb, the promise of a maxed out character. As for me, I do like the change to a set cap, but I do wish that it would be increased just a bit further. It's also important to note that, like performance, Gunfire is keeping an eye on this and is actively making improvements, with the 65 cap I shared earlier being an increase from the original 60 available at launch. Sound design and music are the last things I want to touch on, as they're miraculous standouts in this package. Every weapon has its own oomph to it, a personality reflected just as much in the sound as it is in the art direction. You can tell they really cared and really wanted to make every single weapon feel like its own. Here's a few examples of exactly what I'm talking about. The music is also just a huge surprise. There is loads of variety here, from the angelic vocals mixed with Americana twang on the Ward 13 theme, to the bombastic shouts trying to drown out the menacing, glitchy undertones on the boss Cancer's theme. It can feel impossibly hard to match that level of AAA quality in sound design and music that studios with deeper pockets can achieve much more easily, so you have to give it to the small team at Gunfire for actually competing and creating a game that sounds full. Remnant from the Ashes was released, it was painfully close to the levels of success that its sequel is now having. The common consensus seemed to be that Gunfire was right about there, but not quite. If you asked someone back then if they should buy Remnant, the reply probably would have been a light tilt back and forth of their head, joined by a squint and a slanted cheek. The devs certainly heard this feedback loud and clear, and Remnant 2 is their ferocious retort. If someone approached me and asked, should I buy Remnant 2? I'd say yes in a heartbeat. In a gaming landscape where AAA games are going for $70 and free-to-play titles have malicious, perfectly calculated marketing schemes to get every last penny out of you, having such a polished shooter with so much content asking for as little as $50 is a miracle. Remnant 2 is also never going to ask you to purchase any seasonal content or cosmetic bundles or anything like that. As of right now, there are 3 substantial DLC packs planned, one more than the last game, and if Gunfire's output is anything to go by, they won't be disappointing with those. So yes, if you have the money and you have the system, I'd say yes. Absolutely get Remnant 2, you won't regret it, and you may even open yourself to a whole new genre, a genre that has quickly become one of my favorites over the past 2 years. Then there's a bigger question, which a lot of people have been asking. Should Remnant 2 be nominated for Game of the Year? Again, if you asked me, yeah, actually. The quality is there, I assure you, not even mentioning the fact that I'd totally be on board with such a product getting that level of recognition. To any Gunfire devs who may be watching, you killed it here. You really did. Aside from a few missteps here, the odd technical issue there, this really is a stunning video game, and I highly encourage you, yes, you, to pick it up if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.